These instruments are for display, not for your trembling hands." The words sliced through the air of the auction house, sharp as a violin bow drawn across steel strings. Every head turned, every glass froze mid-sip. The elderly man stood motionless, his weathered fingers hovering inches from the Stradivarius he had once played in concert halls across Europe. His eyes, still bright beneath heavy brows, reflected 60 years of music and memory, now clouded with public humiliation. The auction curator's voice carried through the marble hall, dripping with the particular disdain reserved for those who've mistaken their place in society's carefully orchestrated hierarchy. What the curator failed to notice was the tall figure in the charcoal suit who had stopped examining the catalog, his attention now fully captured by the unfolding scene of casual cruelty. The Worthington Rare Instrument Collection's private exhibition glittered with wealth and exclusivity. Crystal chandeliers cast precise light on violins, cellos, and guitars, worth more than most homes, their varnish gleaming behind velvet ropes. Champagne flowed freely among collectors and investors who viewed these masterpieces not as vessels of sound, but as appreciating assets. The elderly man, Viktor Novak, stood out in his well-worn but immaculately kept suit, a relic from another era when he had been celebrated rather than dismissed. The Guarneri violin in the display case before him was no stranger. It had been his companion for 30 years before financial ruin forced him to sell it to the collection. Now, after decades, he had finally secured an invitation to see it again, reaching instinctively to touch what once was an extension of his soul. The curator, Edward Harrington, stepped forward, manicured hand extended as if to physically create distance between the artifact and this unwelcome intruder. "Security," he called, voice pitched to carry just enough for nearby patrons to hear, to witness his authority. "Please escort Mr. Novak to the general viewing area." The murmurs began immediately. Soft laughter, exchanged glances, the subtle currency of social hierarchy changing hands. Victor's shoulders curved inward, decades of dignity crumbling under collective judgment. And that's when Keanu Reeves set down his champagne flute, moving with the quiet purpose that had made him a legend both on screen and off. What happened next would be shared 500,000 times before morning, a moment when Hollywood collided with humanity in the most unexpected way. Viktor Novak had not meant to cause a scene. At 78, he had long ago accepted that the world moves forward, leaving behind those who cannot keep pace. He had spent 30 years teaching music to schoolchildren after his performing career collapsed, finding joy in young hands, learning what his could no longer perfectly execute. The invitation to the Worthington exhibition had arrived unexpectedly. A former student now working in arts administration had remembered his old teacher's stories of the Guarneri, the instrument that had once been the extension of his soul. The exhibition hall's atmosphere was thick with privilege, conversations about investment portfolios mingling with discussions of provenance and auction estimates. Viktor moved through it like a ghost, invisible until the moment he wasn't. The Guarneri sat in its case of bulletproof glass, under lighting designed to highlight the amber depths of its varnish rather than invite music. The small card beside it mentioned its craftsmanship, its history of ownership, its estimated value, but nothing of how it sang in Viktor's hands during the Mendelssohn Concerto at Carnegie Hall, or how it had wept with him the night his wife passed. When Viktor's fingers had reached toward the display, it wasn't to touch, merely to conduct the memory of music that lived within him still. He hadn't expected the sharp reprimand that followed, hadn't prepared for public humiliation. Edward Harrington had built his reputation as a curator who understood value, not the sentimental kind, but the tangible worth that could be calculated, insured, and most importantly, increased. At 43, he had transformed the Worthington collection from a dusty assemblage of instruments into a blue-chip investment portfolio disguised as cultural preservation. Tonight's event was to be his crowning achievement, an exclusive preview before tomorrow's auction, where 3 instruments were expected to break records. The champagne was French, the canapés Japanese Nordic fusion, the guest list meticulously curated. When security had flagged the elderly man's unusual interest in the Guarneri, Edward had been midway through explaining the instrument's exceptional projection qualities to a hedge fund manager considering it as a diversification strategy. He had crossed the room with practiced smoothness, intending a gentle intervention. But something about the old man's presumption, the way his fingers had extended toward the glass as if he had some right to the treasure beyond, triggered a calculated public correction. "These instruments are cultural artifacts, sir, not toys for demonstration," Edward continued, performing now for his audience of wealthy patrons. "The oils from human hands can damage the varnish. That's why we have strict protocols." His smile was professionally apologetic, but his eyes remained cold. Around them, the crowd's reaction validated his authority. Nods of approval, appreciative glances. The social choreography was proceeding exactly as designed. Keanu Reeves had not planned to attend the exhibition. A last-minute invitation from a friend in the industry had coincided with a rare evening free from filming, and something about the quiet appreciation of craftsmanship had appealed to him. He moved through the room with the particular anonymity that celebrities paradoxically achieve, seen by everyone, approached by no one, existing in a bubble of respectful distance. He had noticed the elderly man earlier, had observed his reverent circuit of the room, the way his gaze lingered not on the instruments' placards, but on the instruments themselves, as if hearing music no one else could perceive. There was something in the man's eyes that resonated with Keanu, a depth of experience, a relationship with art that transcended the transactional nature surrounding them. The curator's words cut through Keanu's contemplation like a discordant note. He watched the interaction unfold, feeling the subtle shift in the room, the silent permission for cruelty disguised as protocol, the collective validation of exclusion. The security guards moved with practiced efficiency, one on each side of the elderly man, not quite touching his arms, but clearly preparing to escort him away. The old man's dignity remained intact, but fragile, like a priceless instrument balanced on the edge of a table. Keanu felt something stir within him, not the calculated intervention of a character from one of his films, but the simple human impulse to right a wrong unfolding before him. He set down his champagne glass and moved forward, his mind made up before he'd fully formed a plan. "Excuse me." Keanu's voice was quiet, but carried a weight that immediately commanded attention. The security guards paused, the curator turned, and conversations around them faltered into silence. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." He moved with deliberate calm, positioning himself not beside the curator, but next to Viktor, a subtle alignment that wasn't lost on the watching crowd. Edward Harrington's expression flickered between recognition and recalibration. A celebrity presence was valuable currency at an event like this, but not if it disrupted the carefully maintained atmosphere of exclusivity. "Mr. Reeves, what an unexpected pleasure." His tone was cordial but cautious. "We're simply maintaining our handling protocols for these priceless instruments." "I understand protocols," Keanu replied, his voice carrying the particular authenticity that had made him beloved beyond his roles. "But I think this gentleman deserves our respect." He turned to Viktor, offering a small but genuine smile. "Would you mind telling me your name, sir?" The elderly musician straightened slightly, dignity returning to his posture. "Viktor Novak." A ripple moved through the crowd. A few of the older patrons exchanged glances of recognition. Somewhere in the room, someone whispered, "The Viktor Novak?" Edward's professional composure wavered for the first time. "Mr. Novak, I apologize if there's been a misunderstanding, but our protocols are quite clear." "That Guarneri," Keanu interrupted, gesturing to the violin in its case. It has a history, doesn't it? Beyond its price tag. It wasn't really a question. Viktor nodded, his voice gaining strength. I played it for 30 years. From 1973 until 2003, when circumstances forced me to sell it. His eyes held no bitterness, only a profound melancholy. I just wanted to see it again. The crowd's attention shifted, the social dynamic transforming. Phones had appeared in hands, recording discreetly. What had begun as an uncomfortable episode of social correction was evolving into something else entirely, a moment of human connection, unfolding against a backdrop of luxury and pretension. "Mr. Harrington," Keanu said, his tone respectful but firm, "I believe we have an opportunity here for something remarkable." Edward Harrington found himself navigating unexpected terrain. The exhibition had transformed from his carefully orchestrated showcase into something beyond his control. He glanced at the assembled guests, calculating rapidly. "Mr. Novak's contribution to classical music is, of course, significant," he acknowledged, attempting to regain narrative control. "But these instruments are extraordinarily valuable and delicate. The Guarneri is set to auction tomorrow with a reserve of $4 million. $4 million, Viktor repeated softly, a ghost of a smile crossing his lips. "When I sold it, it was for $800,000. I needed the money for my wife's medical treatments." He looked at the violin with the tenderness one might show a long-lost child. It was worth every penny, though the treatments didn't save her in the end. Phones were recording openly now, the wealthy crowd captivated by the unfolding drama. A silver-haired woman in diamonds stepped forward. "I saw you play the Tchaikovsky Concerto in Vienna, 1987. I've never heard anything like it since." Viktor bowed slightly in her direction, genuine gratitude in his eyes. "You are too kind, madam." "These instruments are meant to be preserved," Edward insisted, though his tone had lost some of its conviction. "Their value lies in their condition, their provenance." "Their value," Keanu interjected, "lies in the music they create." His voice remained gentle, but carried throughout the now silent room. A violin kept behind glass might as well be made of plastic. He turned to Viktor. "When was the last time you played, Mr. Novak?" "I teach still, but with student instruments. I haven't touched a fine violin in years." Viktor's hands trembled slightly, not with age, but with emotion. "My fingers remember, though. They never forget." Edward recognized the shifting tide of public opinion. Wealthy collectors were exchanging glances, nodding slightly. The woman who had seen Viktor in Vienna was whispering to her companion, who happened to be one of the auction's biggest potential bidders. Keanu addressed the curator directly, his expression open but resolute. "Mr. Harrington, I understand your concern for these beautiful instruments. But isn't music what they were created for, not silence behind glass?" The room held its collective breath, waiting for Edward's response. The curator looked from Keanu to Viktor, then to the watching crowd, acutely aware that whatever happened next would likely be shared across social media before the night was over. Edward Harrington weighed his options carefully, professional instinct warring with the undeniable shift in the room. He was no villain, merely a curator who understood his responsibility to preserve historical treasures. Yet something in Viktor's dignified stance and Keanu's quiet advocacy had created a moment that transcended usual protocols. "The instrument is scheduled for auction tomorrow," Edward said finally. "Any handling risks altering its condition." A new voice entered the conversation, firm, confident, carrying the unmistakable tone of wealth accustomed to being heard. "I'll indemnify any potential damage." All heads turned to locate the speaker, an elegant woman in her 60s, wearing a simple black dress offset by a single strand of pearls. "Margaret Chen," she introduced herself, though many already recognized the tech entrepreneur turned arts patron. "Mr. Harrington, I'll sign whatever waiver your legal team requires." She smiled at Victor. "I believe we all would benefit from hearing this instrument speak again through worthy hands." Edward recognized defeat disguised as opportunity. "That's extraordinarily generous, Ms. Chen, but our protocol—" "Sometimes protocols must bend for something greater," Keanu suggested, his voice carrying no judgment but firm conviction. "Isn't that what art is about? Breaking rules to create something beautiful." The room had become perfectly still, the atmosphere electric with anticipation. Phone cameras remained raised, capturing what was quickly becoming a collision between institutional rigidity and human connection. Victor stood straighter now, his eyes fixed on the Guarneri. "I would treat it with the same care I always did," he said softly. "We were partners for 30 years. Edward looked at the faces around him, the wealthy collectors who funded the Worthington collection, whose goodwill he needed to cultivate. To his surprise, he saw not disapproval, but expectation, even excitement. Margaret Chen raised an elegant eyebrow, waiting. Several others nodded encouragingly. The curator made his decision, professional survival instinct merging with the unexpected opportunity before him. He straightened his tie, summoning graciousness from his repertoire of professional responses. "Perhaps," he conceded, "we might make a singular exception, given Mr. Novak's unique relationship with this particular instrument." He gestured to one of his assistants. "Julia, would you please prepare the performance area and ensure our media team is capturing this special moment?" Victor's weathered face transformed with quiet joy. Keanu stepped back, content to become just another member of the audience, though many phones still tracked his movements, his simple act of decency. The Guarneri emerged from its glass sanctuary with ceremonial reverence. White-gloved assistants moved with practiced precision, transferring the instrument to a velvet-draped table. The exhibition hall had transformed, chairs hastily arranged in a semicircle, lights adjusted to create an impromptu performance space. Guests migrated toward this new configuration with anticipation usually reserved for auction highlights. Viktor Novak stood quietly to the side, watching the preparations with a complex mix of emotions playing across his weathered features. His hands, those instruments that had translated his soul into sound for decades, hung at his sides, still, yet somehow alive with anticipation. Beside him, Keanu remained a steadfast presence, neither intruding nor withdrawing. "It's been 17 years, Victor said softly, for Keanu's ears alone. "What if I can no longer do it justice?" Keanu's response carried the simple wisdom that had endeared him to millions. "The music is still in you. The violin will remember." Edward Harrington approached with the air of a man who had pivoted gracefully to navigate new circumstances. "Mr. Novak, we've prepared everything. Our staff has tuned the instrument, though of course you may wish to adjust it yourself." His professional persona had reasserted itself, now positioned as facilitator rather than gatekeeper. "Perhaps you might favor us with a brief demonstration piece?" Victor nodded, moving forward with dignity. The crowd parted before him, their expressions transformed from earlier condescension to reverent anticipation. Whispers fluttered through the gathered elite. Information passed from those who recognized the name to those who didn't. Recorded with the Berlin Philharmonic, his Paganini was unmatched. Lost everything caring for his wife. The assistant presented the violin and bow with ceremonial deference. Victor accepted them, his expression shifting to one of profound recognition. His fingers curled around the familiar neck of the instrument, his other hand weighing the bow as if greeting an old friend. For a moment that stretched into eternity, he simply held the violin, reacquainting himself with its weight, its contours. The room waited, collectively holding its breath. Edward glanced nervously at his watch, at the recording equipment, at the expectant faces of his patrons. And then Viktor lifted the violin to his shoulder, tucking it beneath his chin with the practiced motion of thousands of performances. He closed his eyes for a moment, a private communion between artist and instrument. When he opened them again, he was transformed, no longer an elderly man being humored, but a master reconnected with his art. The first note hung in the air like a drop of pure light. Viktor drew the bow across the strings with a touch so delicate yet so certain that the violin seemed to inhale before singing. He began with Bach, the prelude from Partita No. 1. 3. A piece that danced between technical brilliance and emotional depth. His fingers moved with the muscle memory of thousands of hours, finding their places on the fingerboard as if guided by invisible forces. The years fell away from Viktor as he played. His posture straightened, his expression transformed from uncertainty to transcendent focus. This was not a demonstration or a performance. It was a reunion, a conversation between old friends who had much to tell each other after a long separation. The assembled audience stood transfixed. Many had attended the world's greatest concert halls, had heard renowned virtuosos perform on priceless instruments, yet something about this moment carried a raw authenticity that professional performances often lacked. Phones recorded, but many were simply lowered as their owners became too engrossed to remember to document. Keanu watched with quiet appreciation, his gaze moving between Viktor's transformed presence and the faces of the audience. Edward Harrington stood with hands clasped behind his back, his expression shifting from professional assessment to unwilling wonder. Margaret Chen dabbed discreetly at the corner of her eye. The Bach flowed into something more personal, a piece few recognized but all felt. Viktor was composing in real time, his fingers finding patterns that spoke of love and loss, joy and sorrow, a life lived fully through music. The Guarneri responded to his touch as if it had been waiting all these years in its glass case for precisely this moment, this player. A young assistant who had been recording the performance for the auction house's social media looked up from her phone screen, tears streaming freely down her face. A hedge fund manager who had been considering the violin as an investment vehicle sat with eyes closed, transported to an emotional landscape he rarely visited. The music built to a crescendo that spoke of triumph over adversity, of beauty that transcends circumstance. Viktor's technique wasn't perfect. 17 years had taken a toll that passion alone couldn't fully overcome, but the imperfections only added humanity to the artistry, like the patina on ancient bronze. And then, in a moment of pure musical poetry, he transitioned into the opening notes of Massenet's Meditation from Thais, perhaps the most achingly beautiful piece ever written for the violin. The melody soared through the exhibition hall, transforming the sterile space into a cathedral of sound. As the final notes of the meditation lingered in the air, Viktor lowered the violin slowly, his eyes opening as if returning from a distant journey. For several heartbeats, the exhibition hall remained suspended in perfect silence, that rare, sacred moment after great music when applause would feel like sacrilege. In that silence lived the true power of what had just transpired, a communion between artist, instrument, and listeners that transcended the transactional nature of the space they occupied. When the applause finally came, it erupted with an authenticity rarely experienced in these halls of wealth and curation. It wasn't the polite, measured approval of cultural obligation, but something visceral and genuine. People rose to their feet spontaneously, their faces transformed. The silver-haired woman who had seen Viktor in Vienna was openly weeping. A young tech billionaire, known for his clinical approach to art investment, stood with hands pressed together as if in prayer. Edward Harrington found himself applauding with unexpected enthusiasm, professional calculations momentarily forgotten in the face of undeniable artistry. His assistant Julia was already at his side, whispering urgently about the social media response. The live feed of the impromptu performance was exploding across platforms, hashtags forming spontaneously around number Violin Master and number Keanu Kindness. Viktor bowed slightly, the gesture carrying the practiced humility of a performer accustomed to acclaim, though his eyes reflected genuine gratitude. When he straightened, he looked at the violin in his hands with a lover's gaze before turning to hand it back to the waiting assistant. "Wait." Margaret Chen stepped forward, her authoritative voice cutting through the continuing applause. "Mr. Novak, that was transcendent." She turned to Edward. "I believe I expressed interest in acquiring this particular piece tomorrow." Edward nodded, professional composure returning. "Yes, Miss Chen, we have your registration for the auction." "I'd like to revise my approach," she interrupted smoothly. Her gaze moved from Viktor to the violin, then to Keanu, who watched with quiet interest. "This instrument has found its true purpose tonight." She addressed Viktor directly. "Mr. Novak, would you consider accepting this violin as a gift, with perhaps one condition attached?" The room fell silent again, this extraordinary departure from protocol creating a new tension. Viktor stood perfectly still, the Guarneri still in his hands, his expression a complex mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. Keanu stepped forward slightly, his presence a gentle reminder of how this moment had begun, with simple human decency challenging arbitrary barriers. "The condition," Margaret Chen continued in the hushed room, "is that you play, not just for yourself, but for others. For students who could never afford to hear a master perform on a Guarneri. For nursing homes where music brings memory back to fading minds. For hospitals where healing requires more than medicine." Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making impossible things happen. "I'll establish a foundation to support this work, if you're willing." Viktor's hands trembled as they cradled the violin. "You would purchase this instrument to give it away?" The concept seemed to exist outside his understanding of how the world operated. "Not give it away," Margaret corrected gently. "Return it to its rightful purpose, with its rightful partner." Edward Harrington cleared his throat, professional instinct warring with the undeniable power of the moment unfolding in his exhibition hall. "Ms. Chen, while your gesture is extraordinarily generous, there are protocols for the auction process." "I'll pay double the reserve," Margaret said without looking away from Viktor. "4 million was the reserve. I'll transfer 8 million tonight. I imagine that will satisfy your auction house protocols, Mr. Harrington." A murmur rippled through the crowd, part astonishment, part appreciation for the power move they'd just witnessed. Edward's objections dissolved in the face of such magnificence. "That would be acceptable," he managed, already calculating the unprecedented commission. Viktor looked from Margaret to the violin, then to Keanu, who offered a small, encouraging nod. "I would be honored," Viktor said finally, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "And I would play until these old hands can play no more." The video of that night spread across social media with the unstoppable momentum that only authentic human moments can generate. Clips of Viktor's performance, Keanu's quiet intervention, and Margaret's extraordinary gesture were shared millions of times within days. Comment sections filled with stories of people's own encounters with elitism, with art denied, with unexpected kindness from strangers. But what resonated most deeply, what caused the story to leap from viral moment to cultural touchstone, was what happened next. True to her word, Margaret Chen established the Novak Guarneri Foundation, dedicated to bringing world-class music to underserved communities. Viktor, reinvigorated by reuniting with his violin, embarked on a tour not of prestigious concert halls, but of schools in low-income neighborhoods, veterans' hospitals, and rural communities where orchestras never visited. Keanu characteristically stepped away from the spotlight once harmony had been restored. When asked about his role in interviews, he deflected with genuine humility. "I just happened to be there. Mr. Novak is the one doing the real work." Edward Harrington, with the adaptability that had made him successful, recognized opportunity in this new paradigm. The Worthington Collection introduced an Artists-in-Residence program, allowing master musicians to play the historical instruments previously kept behind glass. Applications flooded in from performers around the world. The auction house's social media channels transformed from showcases of exclusivity to celebrations of musical heritage brought to life. Their follower count tripled in a month. Their engagement metrics became case studies in authentic brand evolution. 6 months later, in a community center in one of Detroit's struggling neighborhoods, 30 children sat cross-legged on a worn carpet, their eyes wide as Viktor Novak explained how the varnish on his violin contained secrets passed down through centuries. Behind the last row of children, unannounced and unassuming, Keanu Reeves leaned against the wall, baseball cap pulled low, watching with quiet satisfaction. "Who wants to hear what 300 years of craftsmanship sounds like?" Viktor asked, his eyes twinkling with the joy that had returned to his life. 30 hands shot up immediately, faces alight with enthusiasm rarely directed toward classical music in this neighborhood. Viktor raised the Guarneri to his shoulder and began to play a simplified version of Vivaldi's Spring that he had arranged specifically for young listeners. A girl in the front row gasped audibly as the first notes filled the room. A boy who had been fidgeting went perfectly still, mouth slightly open in wonder. After the performance, as children tentatively approached to ask questions and even gently touched the violin under Viktor's careful guidance, the center's director sidled up to Keanu. "They'll remember this forever," she said softly. "Most of these kids have never heard a live instrument that wasn't in church or a school band." Keanu nodded, watching Viktor place the violin in a young girl's hands, showing her how to hold it properly. "That's the thing about instruments," he replied. "Their value isn't in what they're worth. It's in what they're worth to people." The director glanced at him curiously. "You know, you started something pretty special that night. Changed a lot of lives." Keanu smiled slightly, shaking his head. "I just nudged an obstacle out of the way. The music was always there. It just needed room to be heard." As he slipped out unnoticed, Keanu's phone buzzed with a notification. Margaret Chen had posted a new video. Viktor playing for patients in a memory care unit, an elderly woman with Alzheimer's singing along, perfectly recalling lyrics she had otherwise forgotten. The caption read simply, "The true value of a violin. Music heals." The story that had begun with an act of casual cruelty transformed by simple human decency had become something more lasting, a reminder that true worth lies not in what we possess, but in what we share. And that reminder continued to spread, one note at a time,